Welcome everyone. This is Jitesh Vital, Program Director for Digital Health and Technology at MDIC, Medical Device Innovation Consortium. I'm really excited to have you all online here today as part of Cybersecurity Awareness Month and for this important discussion on Playbook for threat modeling medical devices. Next slide, please. So those who are new here, I wanted to give a very brief overview of MDIC. MDIC, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium, is a public-private partnership. It's a non-profit organization. We purely focus on advancing regulatory science through collaborative efforts. We work on multiple pre-competitive initiatives. As you can see here, we have three broad category of members, which include government agencies like FDA, CMS, NIH, and so on, including international regulatory agencies, and then industry, which includes device and diagnostic manufacturers, digital health sector, as well as wellness products. And of course, patients and the patient advocacy groups are part of our major stakeholders, other academics and other non-profit organization. And on the right, you can see here, we purely focus on regulatory science. And we actually touch upon almost in their total product life cycle in our project or programmatic areas. And there are a lot of resources available from MDIC free of cost for the public. You can visit our website, www.mdic.org. And you can also see how we can engage with the MDIC and the MDIC members once you visit our website. Next slide, please. Today's discussion is all about cybersecurity, with specifically for about the threat modeling for medical devices. And this particular initiative was made possible by a funding from FDA to MDIC and MITRE in 2019 with the intended deliverable of a threat modeling bootcamp series, as well as a playbook. I'm no means subject matter expert on these topics, but we have an amazing line of working group members and panelists here today, and they are going to discuss in detail. Next slide, please. We just want to highlight that this project is not something about an individual product, but we are as good as how better we can threat model the devices together, and it's a very collective effort in terms of threat modeling the devices. You can see the stakeholders involved, and we wanted to achieve good medical device threat modeling altogether. And prime focus here is patient safety, and no means to just satisfy some requirement of FDA, even though FDA has helped to advance this particular project. Next slide, please. Just want to thank the working group members who have been leading this project for past 2 years. Most of the members listed here from MDIC, MITRE, and FDA are available online. Some of them will be speaking now, and others will be available as panelists at the end of the session for answering the questions from the audience. Next slide, please. And again, in addition to the working group members I showed in the previous slide, we had almost 24 subject matter experts from industry, from academia, and other non-profit organization, including non-medical device sector, to help us during the past 2 years for this project, to come up with the boot camps and help us in the playbook. These are some of those individuals helped us. Without their contribution, this would not have been possible. So I wanted to thank them again. Next slide, please. And with that, I wanted, before I hand over to the speaker from FDA, all the speakers, as I mentioned, will be available online after the presentation, including the working group members I mentioned for answering your questions. Please do use the Zoom Q&A option to share your questions and comments as the session progresses, so that we can continue to monitor and answer those questions at the end. With that, I wanted to hand over to Jessica Wilkerson, who is the Senior Cybersecurity Program Manager at CDRH at FDA. Jessica.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, I am the speaker from FDA here. So like Jitesh said, I'm a senior cyber policy here at FDA, and I have been helping to manage this project certainly over the last year or so, and with help from a few other folks prior to that. If we can go to the next slide. So to just give some basic overview, the big thing that we thought would be important to provide is a little bit of context on why we did this. You're going to see in this timeline on the next slide that FDA has spent about 2 years on this project, so it hasn't been a small undertaking. And what exactly is it about threat modeling? Why did we think this was important enough to dedicate 2 years and multiple staff members' time to this? And it's because of what's here, right? Threat modeling has become a recognized cybersecurity best practice, both generally, so not just in healthcare, but across all sectors in cybersecurity as a rule, but also within the medical device subsector. And as you can see here, many organizations in both the private and public sectors already recommend threat modeling to help manage and respond to cybersecurity risks. It's included in the Joint Security Plan from the Healthcare Sector Coordinating Council. It is certainly included in FDA's own draft pre-market guidance that I assume most of you are familiar with. The International Medical Device Regulators Forum recommends it, as does AMI. So this is something that is well known, or at least it is a practice that everyone has come to recognize the value of. But it's a very complex, and it involves an incredibly specialized set of knowledge and expertise to really effectively apply. So in the interest of doing this, what FDA recognized is that if we were going to recommend this, and all of these other groups were going to recommend this, and this was something we really wanted the sector to do, and not just do, but be able to do very well, it would benefit us and it would benefit the sector to create an educational resource for the medical device subsector to use to learn how to threat model. So that's exactly what we set out to do. Next slide. So we did this over a couple of steps. As you can see, there were 4 major activities here, and then one of them hasn't even necessarily occurred yet, but we're coming up on it. We started out with what we were calling the Train the Trainers Boot Camp back in February of 2020. So that one actually happened in person. This was pre-pandemic, where we recognized the fact that, look, the medical device subsector is a huge sector. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of companies who are involved, and we were never going to be able to physically train all of them. But what we could do is train people to then go out and train other people to do threat modeling in the medical device subsector. So we got a bunch of trainers together, we trained them how to do threat modeling, and that's what that first boot camp is really targeted towards. Boot camp 1 then followed, where we sort of let the folks that we had trained loose, along with our experts, who you're going to be hearing from right after me. And we got down to the actual goals of the project. We started saying, you know, here's how you do threat modeling, and walked them through the various steps how to threat model from end to end. When I say we, please don't, this is not me. This is definitely who you're going to hear from and our experts. Bootcamp 2 followed. We did a couple of adjustments there. One of the big things that came out of between Bootcamp 1 and Bootcamp 2 is recommendations based on our attendees that any additional medical device specific work or examples or things like that would be helpful in terms of putting this specifically into context for the sector. So that second bootcamp really did involve an additional medical device focus that wasn't necessarily present within Bootcamp 1. And so those are the 3 actual, if you want to call them development activities, that really helped us get a handle on threat modeling in the medical device subsector. And now we are at Q4 2021, where we are looking forward to the playbook release, which is anticipated here shortly. So this is, as you can see, this has been quite the undertaking, and we are incredibly excited to be able to share this work with you, hopefully here very shortly, but in this overview today. So welcome and thank you for attending. But if we can go to the next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about scope. So today's briefing is a general overview of the upcoming playbook. It is not, and please let me repeat, it is not focused on how threat modeling fits into FDA pre-market reviews or FDA recommendations for how threat modeling is performed. We will not be answering FDA-specific questions on submissions. Full stop. We're not going to be asking them, we're not going to be answering them, so please don't ask them. If you have specific FDA questions on submissions, we recommend that you reach out to FDA directly via the Q-Sub process. But again, please don't. It just saves us time. It saves you disappointment. And then I will just reiterate, I know we've got the chat box listed. Please don't put your questions in the chat. Please put your questions in the Q&A. We've got a lot of attendees, and that chat, as you've seen, has been flying by rather fast. So to ensure that we don't miss your question, please put it in the Q&A function. And I'm done. So please, please go ahead and I'll turn it over to our next speaker. Thank you.
Adam, take over, please.
Okay, I'm just attempting to start my video here so I can smile at people, and it says the host has stopped it. So let's go to the next slide. And what I really want to say is first, thank you, Jessica, Jitesh. Thank you to all of the trainers who have participated in this bootcamp process. I am an expert in threat modeling, and I've been working with FDA, with MDIC, and with this community for the last several years because there is, as Jessica said, there's this complexity, and there's also a perception of complexity that threat modeling is simply too hard to do. And I think that's really held us back, and that it's been to everyone's detriment that we've been held back. And so the bootcamp process, where we came together with over 100 people in the medical device community in these different waves, as Jessica described, has given us confidence that this is something that we really can do to make threat modeling a part of the way that we make medical devices safer. And so I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited about the progress of the playbook. Looking forward to that becoming available. Again, because bringing threat modeling into the design of devices early, thinking through what we're doing so that they're secured by design, they're secured from day one, is so important. With that, I want to hand it over to Matt Weir from MITRE, who I believe will be speaking next. Matt?
Thank you, Adam. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the threat modeling playbook itself here. Next slide. So when developing this playbook, we had to look at all the people that could benefit from this here, and we really tried to tailor it to organizations that are trying to stand up a threat modeling process and mature that inside their organization itself there. So not only did we really want to talk about how do we go about the threat modeling the medical devices, but we really wanted to also cover different tips and tricks on how to incorporate that into your product development lifecycle. Next slide, please. So to that end, the playbook is split into 4 chapters with a pretty hefty appendix at the end of it there. So what I'll be doing today is I'll be talking about chapter number 2, which is kind of the threat modeling overview portion of it here. Penny Chase will be talking later about the considerations for implementing the threat modeling. And then Dr. Kyle Wallace will kind of finish us off here by talking about some of these additional medical devices that we've included into the playbook in the appendix there. So next slide, please. So let's talk about chapter 2 and kind of go over some of the different techniques that we talk about in this playbook for how do we do threat modeling. So next slide, please. So we structured chapter number 2 kind of around these 4 questions developed by Adam Shostak. And I'll be talking about these questions a little bit more in a couple minutes here. But really, when we were trying to go ahead and develop how do we go ahead and make this playbook here, we realized that we can't cover every single possible medical device out there. There's no way that we can make this an answer key. So instead, what we really wanted to do was focus on teaching different threat modeling techniques. So not only the threat modeling techniques themselves, but also the challenges that people come across when they try to apply these techniques as well. And so we tried to highlight different challenges and how to deal with them and how to identify them as well before you hit them. So next slide, please. So one of the first questions that we really had to kind of deal with, though, when developing this is selecting a medical device in order to use examples for when doing threat modeling in the playbook. So we eventually selected a fictional medical device called the Ankle Monitor Predictor of Stroke, or AMPS. And we designed it specifically so that the sensor itself has no real-life therapeutic value whatsoever. So don't try to think too hard about, how an ankle monitor could predict stroke. We specifically made that to be kind of as I said, a fictional example here. And the really nice thing about this is it allows us to go ahead and design this example here, then to have different features that are very useful from a threat modeling training perspective. Now, we wanted this to be kind of a realistic fictional example, though. So we did, heavily based this upon both NIST's and COE's special publication 1830, Securing Telehealth for Remote Patient Monitoring Ecosystems. And if you squint a little bit, it sort of looks like a kind of a fingertip pulse oximeter. So we incorporated a lot of the features found in real-life medical devices, and we're going to make this fictional medical device here. Next slide, please. So this is a kind of a very high-level data flow diagram of the device itself. If you kind of look at this here, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. And that's wonderful from a training perspective here, because there's a lot of different areas here that we can really talk about some interesting aspects when trying to threat model real-life devices here. So in the top left-hand corner, we can see that there's the actual device, medical device itself. This medical device talks to a patient's cell phone that's actually, usually out of control of a medical device manufacturer, so that adds interesting aspects to it. This then talks to a cloud-based infrastructure, so that's another area there. We have multiple different stakeholders that are accessing this cloud-based infrastructure that people have to be careful about, and then we have to look at how we update this whole system as well. So we actually used this example here during our second boot camp, and we had students practice their medical device, the threat modeling against it here, and we had really good positive feedback about the different aspects of this device and how this applied to learning threat modeling skills. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that we kind of structured chapter number 2 around these 4 different questions here. And these 4 questions help provide kind of a framework and guidance for how you do the threat modeling process here. So the very first question is just trying to understand, what are we working on? So understanding the device itself and how it actually operates. So in this portion of the playbook, we really kind of go over different types of diagramming techniques. Now, there is no one perfect diagram that you can use in order to, totally understand your device and, do all your different threat modeling, techniques against it there. So we really want to kind of talk about different types of modeling techniques that you can use and how they can work together. For example, a data flow diagram is kind of useful to be able to identify how different devices talk and interact with each other, where if you're trying to go ahead and do analysis of like high value data flows or protocol analysis, you might want to use something like a state machine or a swim lane diagram in order to really try to understand those different protocols there. So once again, it's just not just one diagram in order to be able to understand your system, but it's how all these different types of diagramming techniques can be applied together in order to get a better understanding of the system that you're threat modeling. Next slide, please. So question number 2 is, what can go wrong? So this is the threat portion of threat modeling here. So what we really want to focus on is structured techniques to perform this threat modeling process. And I really want to kind of focus on the word structured there. So rather than just trying to do a kind of ad hoc brainstorming, we really want to try to add some kind of frameworks around how you perform your threat modeling. So, for example, one option is STRIDE, which stands for Spoof, Tamper, Repudiate, Information Disclosure, Denial of Service, and Escalation of Privileges. So this is kind of a structured way to be able to think about threats against your medical device. We also covered attack trees, both threat-driven and fault-driven attack trees. So you might find those a lot of times in other safety-critical applications. We covered kill chains in the cyber attack lifecycle, and we also covered the attack framework as well. Next slide, please. The next kind of question, and this is probably the most important one there, is, what are we going to do about this here? So once you've identified threats, how are you going to go ahead and manage those threats? So in the playbook, we really focused on 4 different main threat mitigation or threat management strategies here. So we looked at eliminating, mitigating, accepting, and transferring. And the real goal of this here is to avoid the silent acceptance and transfer of risk. So this is something that we really want to be able to avoid here. And an example of this is, for example, let's say someone during the threat modeling process says, we assume our devices only can be connected to a secure network. Well, that really is not that helpful to the end users of your device here, because that assumption adds a lot of different ideas in there, and it eliminates a lot of threats silently. And so what we really want to be able to do is get people to really be mindful about the different threats that are against these different devices here, and be able to document and understand, how we're handling and dealing with these threats. So it's not that we have to go ahead and eliminate and mitigate every single possible threat, but we really need to be able to document how these threats are being handled so that the end users of these devices can really understand that. We also talked about different threat scoring mechanisms as well, such as the CVSS rubric for medical devices, as well as the NIST Special Publication 830 Guide for Conducting Risk Assessments. Next slide, please. And so the final question really is, did we do a good job? And this one gets a little bit meta, actually, but it really kind of is understanding that threat modeling is a kind of a continuous process. And it's not something that you just do once and then you're completely done there. It's something that we really want people to be able to incorporate early on into their device product lifecycle. So what we really want to kind of highlight too is just, different areas of feedback. So, kind of understanding, like, are these, where are areas that we can go ahead and improve our threat modeling process, and really kind of understand how we can develop this and make it more mature over time, because threat modeling it's a skill, and it's a skill that gets better the more and more that you threat model here. So with that here, I think I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Penny Chase. So next slide, please.
Matt talked about what threat modeling is and how we threat model medical devices, but we also wanted to provide some information on how an organization could implement threat modeling, both from the perspective of how it fits into the development life cycle and how and some of the organizational considerations. So next slide. So Jessica mentioned the Joint Security Plan, and the JSP creates a framework for how to incorporate cybersecurity into existing quality processes throughout the life cycle. It focuses on 3 elements: cybersecurity risk assessment, which is conducted throughout the life cycle to determine the impacts of cybersecurity risks on patient safety, which may lead to elevating these issues to the safety risk processes that the manufacturer has. The JSP also emphasizes that this risk assessment should reflect the operational environment and intended use case. A device typically is living somewhere in a hospital, a clinic, a patient's home, and the device itself could create problems for that environment. So you need to consider the environment and not just the device itself. The second element the JSP focuses on is design controls. So these are the processes that are used to ensure that designs are assessed throughout the life cycle, and the center part of the framework shows some of the security activities that are used, ranging from setting requirements for security, vulnerability scanning, code analysis, verification and validation, through security testing, penetration testing, and so on. So threat modeling, I should have said the threat modeling can inform risk assessment. It also can inform and complement all of the design control activities shown in the framework. And finally, once a product is launched, vulnerabilities can now be discovered through complaint handling, through field monitoring, through threat information sharing. And as those vulnerabilities and risks are discovered, they should be threat modeled. And that may in turn go and lead to additional design and development. As you can see in the JSP, there are a lot of feedback loops along the lines of what Matt was talking about. Next slide. But, we've talked about the 4 questions as framing how we do threat modeling, and the question may arise, how does that fit in with these risk management processes? So now we're going to look at AMY TIR 57, which Jessica also alluded to. And TIR 57 recommends a security risk process that's parallel to the safety risk process found in ISO 14971. And we can go and see how the questions align during these risk processes. So the first question, what are we working on? So the first part of doing a risk analysis is producing a product inventory, so you kind of know what what you're working on, what's there, what comprises the device. And so that goes a long ways towards helping us answer that first question. Next slide, please. So what can go wrong? So part of the risk analysis is basically doing the analysis to answer that question. TR 57 focuses on using threat intelligence to understand the security risks, and the JSP focuses on those design control activities we talked about on an earlier slide. Threat modeling can supplement those, and in turn I uncover additional risks, which will create additional design requirements. And we again have that feedback loop that we saw in the JSP framework and also in this diagram. And next slide. So what are we going to, well, I guess what are we going to do about it? You end up implementing security or potentially safety controls. And the diagram really shows the interaction between these. Once you have created a control to mitigate or eliminate a risk, you then have to go back and determine if that might introduce a safety risk, if it might introduce an additional security risk. So again, this is an iterative process. Matt talked about 4 strategies, and the controls described in AMY TR 57, which derive from ISO 14971, are inherent security by design, protective measures, and providing security information. So we can see that inherent security by design maps to the elimination strategy. Protective measures maps to the mitigation strategy, and providing security information means that you're going to be transparent about what you're doing. And so if you're using acceptance or transference as a strategy, you're going to not do it silently. You're providing information about what you're doing. And once again, all of this may initiate new rounds of design in order to eliminate and mitigate the risks. And next slide. So finally, did we do a good job? That really breaks down into 2 questions. Did we do a good job of identifying the threats? And did we do a good job of identifying the risk controls? So the JSP, the design control and feedback loops, which kind of align with what Matt was talking about when he described how to tell if you did a good job, really goes a long way towards answering, did we do a good job of identifying threats? Because it provides activities that may identify additional threats and validate what we've done. Then did we do a good job of identifying risk controls? But AMY TR 57 talks about testing, but testing is insufficient on its own. You find what you test for. And so one thing that's been suggested by some of our stakeholders is bringing in external evaluators who were not involved with developing the threat model, but can serve as a fresh pair of eyes. Next slide. So in addition to how threat modeling fits into the development processes, we also wanted to provide some information on how manufacturers who've already adopted threat modeling have implemented it from an organizational perspective. So we interviewed some stakeholders to get a range of perspectives from manufacturers, small, medium, and large, from consultants, from ISAOs. And we also leveraged what we heard during the boot camp, there were lots of discussions about these practical considerations, both in the face-to-face sessions and the chats. And in the survey that we conducted after the boot camp, we asked a question about how threat modeling was used in your organization and found some interesting items there as well. Next slide. So some of the organizational considerations, first of all, there are lots of different approaches. In some organizations, they distribute threat modeling throughout the product teams. In others, they have a central group either at the enterprise or business unit level. And finally, there may be a hybrid approach where there is a central group, but they are embedded in the product teams. Having the product teams do threat modeling is really good because they're the people who really intimately understand the product. But having some kind of centralization, whether it's complete centralization or a hybrid form, that can serve as a force multiplier. That central group can create a threat catalog used by all the different product teams. It can provide templates so the organization does consistent documentation. They can qualify threat modeling tools that can then be used throughout the enterprise, and they can be the people who conduct those independent reviews we talked about to help assess whether we've done a good job. And we also asked about challenges and current practices. So a big challenge is scaling. I mean, as Adam said at the beginning, there aren't a lot of people who are skilled threat modelers. So some of the approaches to try and deal with that, again, is to use this hybrid approach where you have some experts who kind of share their expertise throughout the organization, develop training programs, or bring in outside consultants, especially when you're just starting up. Kind of then there's buy-in and adoption and kind of mutual self-help. Some of the organizations we talked to suggested it's valuable to create a threat modeling community of interest, to go and share experiences across the company and help get all parts of the company buy into adopting threat modeling. And finally, the existing quality processes. At some point, threat modeling activities will probably become a part of the quality processes. But even before that happens, as you introduce threat modeling activities, think about what it will mean to integrate those activities into quality processes and kind of try and do things so you'll make it easier to do that. And I believe that's my last slide. I'm now going to turn things over to Kyle.
Thank you, Penny. So to close out today's talk, I wanted to talk a little bit about one of the things that we did to try and add extra value to the playbook, which is to generate additional fictional medical device examples, much like the back of your math textbook. Next slide, please. And next slide. So the obvious question in generating additional medical device examples is, well, what have we done so far and what is there left to do? We've already talked about one of the examples that we used to kind of serve as the vehicle for talking about threat modeling in chapter 2. That was AMPS. And AMPS, we tried to make that a very, as comprehensive a device system as you would think. It was a distributed platform. You have cloud components, you have mobile components that interface with either the Play Store or the iOS App Store. You have components of that mobile device being a personal device to the patient, so you have to deal with hardware that you don't necessarily control. And it has a telehealth component. So this is kind of a new wave of medical application that's coming out within the past couple of years, and it's only going to grow. So we felt that was an important aspect to address. But there are some obvious things that AMPS did not cover. Number one is AMPS does not really have any therapeutic treatment value whatsoever. It is more of a diagnostic device that tells you something is wrong, but it doesn't necessarily interact with the patient. There's also a class of medical devices, imaging devices, that we felt were very important to address. These generate a lot of very important patient data, and we wanted to make sure we at least took a little bit of time to talk about that. As AMPS was a telehealth device, we didn't really have any interactions with hospital networks, so we really wanted to take some time to talk about that. And primarily, the big elephant in the room is we never really touched on the subject of potential for patient harm and how you integrate that into your threat models. Next slide, please. So the first medical device, and again, these are fictional medical devices where if you squint hard enough, they look like something you might actually see. We call it the Stroke Nerve Effective Photography System, SNAP for short. We embraced a little bit of our sci-fi nerd background here and came up with something that looked a little bit futuristic. You have this platform. It's got this guidance ring that moves up and down, scanning the patient and generating a full body render of the patient's nervous system. Now, obviously, we don't have sensors that can necessarily do that. Well, we might. Technology is usually surprising. But this fills a lot of the roles that we wanted to talk about. It's an imaging device. It's this large-scale device that you would imagine deployed in a hospital. It fills up a room. It has a control station attached to it that runs enterprise Windows software that a nurse would interact with. It generates a lot of personal health information. You know, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't want a full body scan of my nervous system getting out into the public. And it also interacts with back-end systems like the hospital electronic health record system or potentially a PACSys system. We also use SNAP as a way to talk about the potential for mechanical failure in medical devices. While SNAP isn't necessarily a therapeutic device that's attached to a patient, it does have a lot of moving parts, things that if they break or fail or twist in the wrong way or any number of things that could go wrong, there's the potential for a patient to get harmed. One of the guidance rods falls over, part of the ring snaps off, strikes the patient. And we talk a little bit about that in the appendix. Next slide, please. The third medical device example we came up with, we called the Stroke Kinematic Ankle and Toe Exerciser, SCATE for short. This was designed to be more of our therapeutic device. We think of it kind of like a boot that you put on your patient. And it has some linear motors inside of it that moves the ankle and the toe back and forth, primarily for trying to recover from potential nerve damage. As our therapeutic devices, let's just talk about a couple of important things. Number one is the potential for direct patient harm and how you would approach implementing hardware and software guardrails and modeling those in your threat model to deal with that threat. This is a smaller device that you could imagine in the hospital, so you could potentially have a whole fleet of these devices deployed across your ecosystem, and this lends itself to the issue of multi-patient harm. So let's say all of these devices go haywire for some reason. Do you take steps to kind of prevent that in your threat model, and is that documented? We envision SCATE would have some kind of back-end server software that manages this fleet of devices. So we use that as a vehicle to talk about, how do you deploy software in places where you don't necessarily have hardware control? And then critically, we kind of take a moment to address one of the critical data flows that exists in pretty much every medical device, and that's how do you update these things? How do you come up with a good firmware update procedure that you can be assured that something isn't going to go wrong or taken advantage of in order to cause some kind of misfortune. So next slide, please. Looking at the clock, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go too deep into this slide, but this slide, if you want to take a look at it, in the recording, this just goes down the list of things that AMP, SNAP, and SCATE individually cover. And we tried to highlight the fact that each of these devices really does cover an interesting subset of aspects that we want to cover, from functionality, the type of software that's running on it, the hardware that's running underneath, whether or not it deals with PHI, what the chance for patient harm is. And so if you want to know more about these, I can say read the playbook. Next slide, please. So at the end of the day, what is the key takeaway? We wrote this playbook specifically because we want people to integrate threat modeling into all phases of the device development lifecycle. all the way from inception of the device down to the eventual distribution of the device to HDOs. To hammer home the point that's been hammered home a bunch of times, we want devices that are secure by design, not secured after the fact. And that's going to benefit a lot of people, from patients to hospitals to, I really don't know who benefits from not having a secured medical device. So we've seen a lot of interest along the way, particularly with talking with manufacturers while writing this. We've gotten a lot of good feedback. And it seems like the industry as a whole is open to this idea of embracing threat modeling and bringing it into their development life cycles. Particularly, some of the feedback we've gotten from a lot of the manufacturers who have already started taking steps towards this. They're very interested in using this threat modeling playbook as a way to springboard their own threat modeling training programs, strategies, building out their team and their expertise. And while we've been talking a lot about how this is the medical device threat modeling playbook, all of the techniques used in this playbook aren't necessarily restricted to just medical devices. They can be used on software, they can be used in other domains. So just because we're in the medical industry doesn't mean that the knowledge that we have here doesn't apply to other industries as well. So if you know people outside of the medical industry that might benefit from this, tell them about it, share this with them, see if it's of any value to them. In terms of some final closing thoughts, yes, this will be publicly available for download eventually, once it is released. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, contact healthcyber@miter.org with your thoughts. Anyway, I will pass it back to Jitesh to close it out.
Thanks, Kyle. Now all the speakers are available right now online, not only speakers, but the working group members of this project from FDA as well as MITRE. Please continue to use the Q&A option in the Zoom, and we already have a lot of questions there. I will continue to answer them either via audio or via typing. And again, please do not use this option to type in any specific FDA-specific question on specific submission that can be answered via pre-sub or Q-sub. And we'll make sure that this webinar is available, recording is available through MDIC website, MITRE website, as well as through Shostak and Associate website. And once the playbook is released, again, it all will be available through all our websites as free download. The registered attendees also will get a link announcing the availability of the playbook. With that, I'll turn to Jessica to moderate the questions. Jessica?
So we had a lot of questions in the Q&A specifically focused on risk assessment. Some of them were a little bit more focused than others, but they all had that general theme. So we're going to answer several of them in one go. So if you just received your question will be answered live, this is probably this one. So I'm going to turn this over to Matt Hazlett, who is on the FDA team here, to provide some additional context and color. But before I do that, we just wanted to quickly reiterate, if we didn't say this up top, I know we possibly have some media folks here who may have some questions. Any specific media questions, please do reach out to the FDA media team. The team that you have on today will not necessarily be answering those. All right, so Matt, if you want to go ahead.
Sure, thank you, Jessica. So largely what we wanted to clarify in terms of the risk assessment discussions that were coming through in the chat, we just wanted to do some level setting and framing. So the primary focus of the playbook is around threat modeling, and a lot of where the questions are going in the scope in terms of the content of Chapter 3 is really to highlight how threat modeling fits into other quality processes that exist at an organization, and we want to ensure that it's understood how threat modeling fits into those processes, one of which being cybersecurity risk assessment. So the playbook itself is not intended to provide any means or serve as a best practice on overall cybersecurity risk assessment methodologies, as that would be a discussion for a larger and different forum than what's included in the playbook. It's more to highlight how threat modeling can inform those other quality processes that already exist at manufacturers, and how the security risk assessments can tie into your existing 14971 assessment. So from the diagrams that were on the slides that Penny presented, she showed the diagram of the different crossover from what's identified in AMI TIR 57 to ISO 14971. So that shows the crosswalk between the security risk assessment and the safety risk assessment. But again, the intent of the playbook is to focus on threat modeling and how it fits into your larger processes, and not serve as a prescriptive or best practice for overall cybersecurity risk assessment processes, even though it does mention them as an aspect.
Well, thank you, Matt, for that. And then the other area that we wanted to quickly cover, I know there are quite a few questions about timeline for release and where the playbook will be released. So if you didn't see it earlier in the slides, we are shooting for Q4 2021, so stay tuned. The playbook will be available for free for download on MITRE and MDIC's individual websites, so keep an eye on those places for when the playbook is out. And I assure you, there will be many celebratory emails and other advertisements that the playbook has been published. So we will do our best to make sure you hear about it. So in terms of additional future boot camps, Ken, I saw your question about future boot camps or additional training for those interested. Let us know. I mean, you've got a good group of people here. You certainly got Adam, who does this as his business. So if there is additional interest in future boot camps, that is something that we would certainly be interested in hearing about. So let us know, and we will take that into consideration. If somebody from our MITRE colleagues that are on the line can take John Volek's question about hardware and talk a little bit about how the playbook can be used to talk about hardware threat modeling, in addition to what was already covered during the slide deck and in the playbook.
So there was a question about hardware coverage and threat modeling, and I think there are potentially some difficulties there, but there is a long history of work in hardware and hardware security and the kinds of attacks that can occur. We do not cover a lot of it in detail within the playbook. One thing to note is that MITRE has a separate project that also does involve hardware security and the kinds of weaknesses and vulnerabilities that can occur within hardware as part of the CWE common weakness enumeration work, and that may be helpful. I don't have anything else to answer on top of that at this point. Apologies.
No worries. You're actually exactly who yourself and I think Matt Weir and Kyle are the ones also positioned to answer Justin Heil's question. Apologies if I just butchered your last name. On the use cases, he had asked whether there be use cases that will start basic and then have added complexity that would highlight different threat model iterations. If you don't mind speaking a little bit to that.
I'll pass that on to Matt Weir.
Okay, yeah. So we did try to cover a few use cases with multiple different steps in it there. So this gets into some of the different threat modeling techniques that you can have as well. So in some of the attack tree driven threat models and in things like using the attack framework, you can start to look at the different stages of attack, kind of in the life cycle of attack and different ways that it can branch out. But there's also other approaches such as Stride, where you're really kind of looking at that one individual part here that where an attack could occur, and then you're using that to kind of build your larger story here. And I'm being mindful of the fact that Adam Shostak is here. We can probably answer way more about threat than I can. But long story short, there's a lot of different ways. Just due to the size of the playbook, we were kind of limited in how comprehensive some of the examples that we could have are. But we did try to show at least a couple examples of tying together kind of longer threat vectors.
Perfect.
So,
go ahead.
yeah, so I wanted to pick up the question of tools and what tools to use. And the thing that I'd really like to emphasize, that the playbook emphasizes, that the threat modeling manifesto emphasizes, is that this is a set of skills to be brought to bear and a set of questions which you should be answering as you are building, as you are designing your devices. And so one of the things behind the tools question is often, how do we avoid spending time thinking, can a tool do this work for us? And the tool can help you organize your thoughts. The tool can help you check completeness. The tool can help drive consistency. But before you get to tool selection, it's really important to develop the skills and to be able to apply them in your device. And Matt talked about how the playbook applies these to the examples. Penny talked about the different models of how organizations take action on these things in chapter 3 and how you make it part of your delivery. And so while there are a lot of great tools out there that can help you do the work, the thing that I really want to emphasize is the importance of learning to answer the 4 questions, learning how your organization is going to answer the 4 questions here, what you're going to do to make sure that you're answering them in ways that you're confident in as you're developing your device, as you're working on the various documentation, and only then pick up a tool.
Thank you, Adam. That was incredibly helpful. And I did want to follow on because there are, again, some questions in the chat looking at how to use the threat model or use the threat modeling playbook and so on. And so one thing that we did really want to reiterate and drive home for everyone, this is not meant to be a how-to guide. This is not meant to be prescriptive. This is not, let me pick this up and immediately be able to have a perfect threat model for maybe specific uses. But instead to be used as an educational resource. So it's very comprehensive. It walks you through from beginning to end how you might effectively threat model. But it is also something where you're expected to have to do some of your own work and your own research, as Adam was saying, of really developing the tool set, the mental tool set, the experience and the expertise of being able to do this, not necessarily just pick it up and use it as a checklist. So I see we are very much at end of time. So I think we're going to have to go ahead and wrap. But we wanted to say, I'm going to turn it back over to MDIC to officially close, but from us here at FDA, and Miter and Adam, please feel free to unmute yourselves and say the same. But thank you all so much for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate the interest and the good questions. And we look forward to being able to get this playbook to you all here just as soon as we can.
Thanks, Jessica. And we will make sure that you all get a notification once the playbook is released in Q4 2021, which is just one more month here, actually. The recordings for this session will be posted, and we'll also try to answer some of the questions we couldn't answer here in the text form when we publish the webinar recordings. And thanks again and for joining with us. And I want to thank our panel members, speakers from FDA and MITRE. And thanks to you all for taking the time and having this engaging session. Thank you all. Have a good rest of the day.